Listen now about Dracovin, Lord Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the EARTHDAWN Roleplaying game system. Well, where we last left off, we were diving into combat, and I began talking about the three types of combat. Today we're going to dive closely into close combat. So close combat is any sort of combat where I'm effectively close. I'm within 2 yards of my opponent. We're right up in each other's faces. This takes the form of both melee and unarmed combat. Many skills and talents are listed for both of these, and particularly under those skills and talents, it will either say it's directly like a melee weapon skill, means I'm using a melee weapon, or under that skill or talent, it will list whether I'm using melee or unarmed. So, melee is basically using anything where I have a melee weapon. This is a sword, axe, staff, spear, all kinds of different things. It's basically a handheld weapon I'm going to smack someone with. Unarmed is, of course, just that. That's using punches, kicks, headbutts, all that sort of thing. Using your body to smack into someone and hit them back. Now, melee combat can have cover. I could have like a low wall in between me and my attacker. There are situations where cover can apply, separating us out to a degree, making it more difficult for either me to be hit or, in general, us to hit each other, depending on the level of cover. If I'm punching around a corner, I'm getting pretty good cover, but then again, I'm also getting that same penalty for fighting out of cover. Now, when I'm in melee combat, I can get harried by multiple opponents. We talked about being harried before. I can get attacked by 6 opponents in melee combat. And as long as I have 4 or more of them around me, I'm, well, being harried. And this will last until I'm down to 3 or less opponents. Basically, when the 4th one dies or is knocked out, then, hey, guess what? I'm no longer harried. I'm ready to fight and punch back against all these guys a lot better. This doesn't mean that there are things that can go beyond this normal limit. There are certain smaller creatures or pack-based creatures which can fit more around me, meaning I could have a lot more than 6 creatures around me. Generally speaking, though, I will have those 6 and they will have a positioning around me. Depending on their positioning around me, depends on some of the kind of bonuses they have. There is a special chart in the book you can look at and compare it. Think of it this way, if someone's behind me, they're blindsiding me. Basically, that's the advantage position that they can get to. And if I'm surrounded, guess what? Someone might try to get into that position. So as I said, melee weapons, they're made with your axes, swords, spears, your basically one-handed weapons. They are made traditionally at 2 yards away. Those certain weapons, at the GM's discretion, could have a greater reach of 2 yards, depending on the weapon itself. A very long spear might be able to stab someone a little farther away than, a sword would. And your game master can reflect that and the nature of that. Again, as I said before, you will use various skills and talent. There is a melee weapon skill and a melee weapon talent. You could use those or specific skills and talents that we'll mention under their description if you use a melee attack with it. It is a standard action to make an attack with a melee weapon. And normally you're only allowed 1 attack a turn. Now, there are certain abilities that will allow you to use more attacks in a turn, allowing you a second attack, which you will need to use a simple action in order to make this extra attack as part of your turn. But you're specifically being granted that by some other kind of talent or ability that is saying, oh, you get a second attack. Generally speaking, only that one, though. Now, all the melee weapons that you're really going to be using are listed under the goods and services. This has things like price, its damage step, other important information relevant to knowing how to use and grasp these melee weapons. Any kind of special rules for using these melee weapons will be listed in a description of each of those within this section. Some of these melee weapons require either minimum strength or dexterity in order to use them. If you do not have these minimums, then you receive a penalty for using this weapon. You're not built to use this weapon. You're not as good about using this weapon. Also, unless otherwise noted, when I'm using a melee weapon, I use my strength step to determine the total damage step. I basically am adding that to the damage step that I'm using for the total damage step for when I stab someone and all the damage tests. It might note something different, but that's going to be the assumed one. Now, you can have a melee weapon with entangling. It not only hits people and deals damage, but it could wrap around them. Goods or services, when we're talking about the weapons, it will list whether they're entangling. It will also list the entangling difficulty. Basically, once I'm entangled about it, how difficult it is to escape from it. I will have to get a good or better result with my attack with the entangling weapon. Good example of this being a whip. And then I've basically entangled my opponent. The target counts as harried for anything they do except for trying to escape from the entangling. They don't count as entangled for that. They can make a strength or dexterity test in order to free themselves. If they have basically a one-handed cutting weapon, they can add its damage step to attempt to free themselves. Basically, they can cut away at it a little bit and break themselves out. So those are the easiest ways to escape from an entangling weapon, is basically just a straight check or cut away at it. Now, there might be points in time where you have to use an improvised weapon. Whether it's a chair, or I'm chucking a rock at something, or, I'm just picking up a stick and hitting someone. It could happen. The Game Master is going to determine all the relevant statistics from it. Its damage step, its minimum requirements, everything as such that you would need to use this improvised weapon. Now, the fact is, you also get a -2 to attack tests using this weapon because it's not made to be a weapon. So you get a penalty for using it. If you're using something like a torch, which is on fire, if you have a pathetic result, you happen to extinguish it accidentally as the course of trying to attack with it. Now, unarmed attacks, as I talked about, are all the punches, kicks, headbutts, all the things that you're doing with my body. I'm just striking someone with my fist. That's an unarmed attack. Now, just like before, there is an unarmed combat skill and a talent. You could use those, or certain skills and talents will list that I could use an unarmed attack or require an unarmed attack / unarmed combat in order to use them correctly. Like with melee weapons, most characters can only get a single unarmed attack in, though certain abilities or talents will allow you to get an extra one in. First one as a standard action, extra one in as a simple action. So at least I'm getting that standard in for punching someone. Now, most of these will be using your basically unmodified strength score as your step for damage. Basically, I'm using raw strength to figure out my damage step against someone. Certain races will have racial abilities like claws or fangs and things like that will grant them bonuses to their unarmed. You do have to be within 2 yards of each other to get into unarmed combat. Now, if I'm in unarmed combat, I can forego my attack for a special rule: grappling. Now, basically for grappling, I forego my standard action, unarmed attack, basically the normal one, and say my unarmed attack is a grappling test instead. Unless I have some other way of doing this test or specific ability, it's going to be assumed to be an unarmed attack test. Against the target's physical defense, I need a good result at least to be successful at this. If I get that good result, I've successfully grappled my opponent. We fall down prone in the same square, and we basically are count as being knocked down for any kind of attempt that check we're doing, except unarmed striking each other or trying to break the grapple. On an excellent result, if I attempt to grapple someone, I can choose to remain standing and just be harried. Basically, I push my opponent down to the ground and kind of get him under my foot. I'm still harried, but I definitely am not knocked down with him on the ground. My result, regardless of what it is, as long as it's successful, becomes the difficulty to escape the grapple difficulty. And using the grappling maneuver causes no damage, so there will be no damage test required. I'm just trying to shove someone down to the ground, or at least grab a hold of them. Now, while we are down tussling on the ground, we don't get any penalties to our action tests in order to basically either maintain this grapple or to break free of it. The target that I have been grappling can either make an unarmed combat test or a strength test versus my grapple difficulty that I've set up. If they are successful, they have broken free and can get up on their own. At your GM's discretion, you could do something else while grappling, but you would have to make your check against the grapple difficulty. That would be the difficulty of whatever test you're doing. In order to do this action, you have to make sure you test against that also, beyond what you normally would test against for whatever action your game master would actually allow. Now, once I have grappled an opponent and I'm down on the ground with them, I can just declare that I'm maintaining this grapple. I don't actually have to do anything to maintain it. It does take a standard action on any consecutive rounds I'm doing this, so I do have to use up my standard actions. But I have another option to do. I could attempt to re-establish my hold. I would make a unarmed combat test against the opponent at the same difficulty I had to originally grab him to get a better hold of him. If I am successful, whatever I get for my new test is the new grapple difficulty. I could also, though, fail on this one and basically in an attempt to get a better position, leave hold of him and no longer be grappling him. So there is a risk involved in this. The reward is, of course, getting a better hold on my opponent so that it's more difficult for them to escape. Disadvantage, well, I could really mess up and they could slip out of the bonds. If you get broken free, if you've escaped the grapple, guess what? Well, both of you are still prone and knocked down on the ground. You can stand up then. But that's it for today. I went over the rules of close combat. This includes melee combat, hitting with swords and axes, and unarmed combat, punching and kicking. I went over all the basics of what it means to use these two types of combat in your EARTHDAWN games. In the next episode, we're going to dive into ranged combat, the second main type of combat we can talk about. Because, hey, guess what? We're chugging through combat really quickly here, so let's hope we can finish it soon. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon. Link to the description below. There's some great rewards there. It helps to grow and improve the channel and the empire. Regardless. Until the next time, I bid you farewell.